High above the African plains, Sirius drags a tiny companion through space, an ultra-dense white dwarf so faint that even the best telescopes of the 19th century could not pull it from the glare of its brighter twin. The Dogon, living in cliff villages along the Bandiagara escarpment, described that same companion long before any modern instrument confirmed its existence. Their accounts, first written down by French anthropologists in 1950, placed the hidden star in a tight 50-year orbit and gave it a density heavier than any ordinary metal. What follows is the chain those details set off. Ancient texts naming fish-shaped visitors, star maps drawn in dust, and precise knowledge of Jupiter's moons and Saturn's rings that should not have existed in an isolated West African society. We will trace every link, then see which ones actually hold when the instruments and the records are laid side by side. The Bandiagara escarpment rises out of the Sahel like a single, unbroken wall of sandstone, 200 meters high in places and running for 150 kilometers across central Mali. Its face is pocked with overhangs and sheer drops, and tucked into those folds sit entire villages of mud brick compounds and thatched granaries perched on ledges no wider than a goat path. UNESCO lists the whole plateau as a living cultural landscape: architecture, sanctuaries, ritual grounds, and the layered traces of settlements that reach back more than 1,000 years. What matters here is not just the stone. The cliff itself acts like a memory archive. Ceremonies still move along its base and up its stair-like trails. Masks and drums echo inside the same rock shelters where earlier generations left their own marks. Walk the lower paths at dusk and you feel how tightly the place and its stories are braided together, every narrow passage and hidden shrine carrying forward the same thread of knowledge that once pointed toward the sky. From the highest terrace, the horizon falls away in every direction, and on clear nights the brightest star overhead is Sirius. The Dogon have always called it by its own name, the star whose light, they say, arrived carrying instruction. In 1952, French anthropologists named Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen dropped a paper that would later get dragged into every serious argument on the planet. It was titled in dry academic French and buried in a journal most people never opened. Inside, they laid out what the Dogon of Mali had told them about a star system they had watched for generations, complete with multiple names and movements that matched nothing visible to the naked eye. The writing itself feels nothing like modern speculation. Page after page of field notes, kinship diagrams, and ritual descriptions sit next to quiet statements about companions too faint or too close to see without special tools. No dramatic claims, just line after line of what the elders said the sky contained. One of those names is Tolo. The paper records it as the tiniest, heaviest thing in the system, a body that pulls on everything around it, even though it stays hidden. That single detail, printed in 1950, is what later travelers carried out of West Africa and into the mystery circuit. Before the paper existed, the same knowledge lived only in songs, masks, and conversations passed between people who already knew what to listen for. Once it appeared in print, anyone with a library card could point to a specific page and say the story had been written down by trained observers. It became something you could cite instead of something you had to believe on faith. The document did not prove visitors from another star. It simply gave the oldest written handle on an oral account that described an invisible stellar partner long before most outsiders had heard of it. Open the yellowed pages today and you still find the same quiet assertion: a hidden star whose orbit the Dogon had tracked without telescopes. In the Dogon telling, Tolo is not a distant point of light, but a seed. Tiny, dark, and impossibly heavy. It circles the brighter star every half-century, its weight bending the path of everything around it. The image is simple and brutal, a single grain dense enough to drag a sun through its dance. That grain matches the profile of Sirius B with uncomfortable precision. The real star is a white dwarf, no larger than Earth, yet carrying the mass of our own sun. Its light is feeble, its gravity ferocious. Exactly the kind of object the Dogon locate at the center of their Sirius system. The seed metaphor turns that extreme density into something you can almost hold, a kernel of matter so compressed that a teaspoon would outweigh a mountain. The claimed 50-year cycle lines up with the orbital period astronomers have measured between Sirius A and B, though the match is never exact enough to close the case on its own. What lingers is the coincidence of scale and behavior. A culture with no telescopes described a collapsed stellar remnant orbiting its companion on the same timetable modern instruments record. White dwarf material breaks everyday intuition. Atoms are stripped and packed until the space between particles nearly vanishes. The result is a star that has traded size for crushing weight. The Dogon seed carries the same signature without the language of nuclear physics or electron degeneracy. Just the sense that something small can still command enormous force. That overlap between an ancient description of a heavy seed and the actual properties of a white dwarf is what keeps the story alive. The question is no longer whether the object exists, but how anyone without modern tools could have known its nature at all. Sirius burns so fiercely in our sky that its companion vanishes inside the glare, a point of light lost in the halo of its bigger sibling. Only high-resolution instruments cut through that brightness. NASA's Hubble image pins the tiny dot as Sirius B, a real stellar body parked beside the famous dog star. That companion turns out to be a white dwarf, the dense leftover core of a once larger star that has already burned through its fuel. It is not a planet, not a second sun, and certainly not some hidden light the Dogon could have invented. It is a collapsed stellar remnant, smaller than Earth, yet packing the mass of our sun into that compact space. The two stars circle each other in a mutual orbit that takes roughly 50 years to complete, a slow gravitational dance that keeps B locked in its tight path. When the European Space Agency processes the same data into a progressive zoom, the reveal plays like a slow pullback. First, the blinding point of Sirius A, then the faint neighbor stepping out of the overexposure, suddenly undeniable. This is why the story keeps its grip. The object is not a myth or a misread planet. It is an actual white dwarf whose existence was only confirmed with 20th century telescopes, yet the Dogon placed a heavy, invisible companion beside Sirius long before those instruments existed. Griol sat with Ogatameli for 33 days in the dust of the cliffs, and what came out of those talks was never a single star fact. It was an entire map of how the world began, told in the language of seeds that fall and split, water that carries order, and blood that finishes what speech cannot. Ogatameli spoke as the one chosen to hand the pattern forward, not as a storyteller offering curiosities, but as the last living hinge between the visible fields and the hidden architecture that holds them up. The cosmology he described kept multiplying. A single seed contained the blueprint for every plant and every law that would govern it. Water arrived next, carrying the force that made those blueprints stand upright. Then came the great sacrifice that scattered the original order across the sky and the earth at once, so that nothing could ever be understood in isolation again. Each layer demanded the next, until the whole system felt less like a belief and more like an operating manual for reality itself. When the same material reached print in the Pale Fox, the density only increased. Diagrams of stars turned into diagrams of bones, and ritual objects carried the same proportions as constellations. The Sirius reference sat inside this thicket rather than standing apart from it, one coordinate among many that pointed to a universe already in motion before any outsider arrived to measure it. What stepped out of that motion were the Nommo, beings who arrived in water, spoke in twin pairs, and carried the knowledge of how to repair a broken world. They were not metaphors for distant suns. They were the active agents who had already performed the repairs once and left the instructions behind in the language of masks, drums, and the cycles of planting. They emerged from the primordial waters as the Nommo, half fish, half man, their bodies scaled and glistening, their voices carrying the first laws of cultivation, kinship, and the sky. In the Dogon telling, they do not simply appear. They arrive already charged with the task of straightening what is bent, of turning chaos into measured fields and ordered speech. Every ritual that follows, libations poured at dawn, masks danced at the end of the dry season, still reenacts that first bringing of order from liquid. Their amphibious form is what catches later ears. Creatures who breathe both air and water, who cross the boundary between the unseen depths and the visible land, begin to sound less like local spirits and more like visitors who mastered another medium entirely. The stories describe a vessel, not a boat of reeds, but something that descends with a spiral of wind and a hiss of steam, settling into the marshes before the teachers step out. No one in the village claims to have seen metal rivets or portholes. The memory is carried in the language of waves parting and a great weight coming to rest. What the Nommo bring is not fire or weapons, but a grammar. They teach how to speak the names of stars so the seasons will answer, how to draw the path of the sun across the granary roof so the millet will follow. Water is never separate from that speech. The same element that carried them is poured in every ceremony that keeps the knowledge alive. The link between liquid, voice, and cosmic timing is what makes the account feel less like a sighting and more like a record of instruction. That sustained precision, specific stars named, specific intervals between their appearances, specific duties tied to each arrival, is what lifts the Nommo above ordinary travelers' tales of lights in the sky. The details sit inside an entire ritual calendar, still performed, not scattered anecdotes. When Robert Temple opened Griol's notebooks decades later, it was this dense weave of water, descent, and transmitted order that he carried forward into print. In the mid-1970s, Robert Temple took the Dogon accounts and refused to file them away as village lore. Instead, he laid them across the entire ancient world like a single circuit diagram. His book, The Sirius Mystery, argued that the same precise knowledge of a dense companion star appeared in Egyptian temple records, Sumerian king lists, and Babylonian star catalogs, all pointing back to one source. Temple followed the trail into the old fish-being legends. Along the coast of what is now Iraq, ancient texts described Oannes, a creature that rose from the Persian Gulf each morning wearing a fish skin, taught writing, astronomy, and law, then returned to the water at night. The description matched the Dogon Nommo in too many details for Temple to dismiss as coincidence. He began pinning those stories to one another on an imaginary map. From the Dogon Plateau, he drew a line to the Nile, another to the Tigris and Euphrates, and a third to the Mediterranean ports where the same amphibian teacher figure kept reappearing under different names. Each new connection made the original claim feel less isolated and more like a surviving fragment of something larger. The real force of the book was that network effect. One tribe's star lore suddenly became the missing key that made half a dozen unrelated myths line up. Readers found themselves tracing the same threads Temple had drawn, wondering how isolated Bronze Age societies could have shared such an odd, specific secret across thousands of miles of desert and sea. Temple's final move was the simplest and the most unsettling. He suggested the knowledge had not been discovered on Earth at all. It had arrived, carried by the beings the stories remembered, and then been parceled out to the earliest civilizations before those beings withdrew. The Dogon in this reading were not the source. They were simply the last place the signal had stayed intact. Laird Scranton's The Science of the Dogon takes the thread and runs it straight into the symbols themselves, treating every carved line and ritual phrase as a compressed data packet. Where earlier accounts stopped at the mention of a faint companion star, Scranton maps the Dogon diagrams of ovals, spirals, and twin seeds onto concepts like orbital resonance and atomic structure, arguing the patterns line up with modern physics when read in the right sequence. The focus slides from star names to an entire encoded cosmology. Proponents point to recurring motifs of vibration, density, and paired opposites that echo wave mechanics and matter creation, suggesting the tribe preserved a working model of how the universe assembles itself, rather than a simple origin story. The claim is that these images function like a living schematic, each element designed to trigger the next in a precise chain. Believers describe the whole system as a memory palace built in ritual and myth, where cosmology, agriculture, and social law sit inside the same geometric grammar. One diagram of a falling seed is said to contain both the orbit of Sirius and the stages of matter's formation, turning a farming story into a cross-referenced archive that could be walked through in ceremony. What keeps the layer electric is how ordinary objects suddenly behave like components. A basket weave becomes a lattice of forces, a ritual dance traces particle paths, and the Nommo's descent reads as both biological arrival and information transfer. The symbols stop being decoration and start operating like working diagrams that reward pattern recognition. Online, the mutation accelerates. Each new post layers fresh overlays onto the same drawings, swapping in string theory, quantum fields, or digital information metaphors until the original Dogon framework carries an expanding cargo of contemporary speculation that never quite settles. The Dogon story refuses to fade because it keeps landing in fresh Reddit threads in 2026, where users still trade the same grainy diagrams of elliptical orbits alongside photos of the Bandiagara cliffs. Some posts tell it straight. The Nommo arrived from Sirius, gave the Dogon working knowledge of a companion star no ordinary eye could see, and folded that knowledge into ritual so it could survive for generations. That is why the thread never behaves like a normal history argument. It has every ingredient that spreads fast online. A single obscure paper, an actual star that matches the shape of the claim, a fish-like being who supposedly brought the data, and the promise that the answer was kept in plain sight by people outsiders underestimated. The story does not need a government bunker or a leaked memo. It has cliff villages, star cycles, ritual masks, old books, and a white dwarf hiding in the glare of the brightest star in the night sky. In its strongest online form, the account becomes almost mythic. The Dogon were handed a map of Sirius, protected it inside ceremony, and carried it forward until modern instruments finally caught up with what the elders had already encoded. That version is exactly why the rabbit hole keeps pulling people in. It is simple enough to explain in a paragraph, visual enough to become a thumbnail, and big enough to make the past feel like it is holding back a door. In this version, the Dogon elders are not guessing at the sky. They are carrying a deliberate curriculum, one that folds the entire Sirius system into ritual so it cannot be lost. The story moves from mouth to mouth across centuries exactly because it is dressed as myth. The listener remembers the dance, the mask, the number of years between ceremonies, and the astronomy rides along for free. Tolo, the heavy seed, is no poetic invention here. It is the white dwarf itself, the dense companion whose orbit drags the bright star through its long, slow waltz. The elders speak of a star so small, yet so weighty, that it bends the path of its brighter twin, and they mark the moment when that companion returns to the same position in the sky. The knowledge is not observed fresh each generation. It is inherited, renewed only when the ritual calendar demands it. The Nommo are recast as the ones who brought the pattern, not invaders or destroyers, but instructors who arrived with the knowledge of how the three stars move and why the cycles matter. Their forms are amphibious in the carvings because water is the medium of the teaching, the element that carries the seed and the canoe that delivers the law. The elders say the Nommo left the pattern behind and then withdrew, leaving the tribe to guard the numbers. That guard is the 50-year cycle itself. Every half-century, the Sigi festival resets the clock, forcing the entire society to recount the positions, the densities, and the invisible companion. The ritual is the archive. Without the ceremony, the numbers drift. With it, the memory stays sharp enough to name a star no telescope had yet confirmed. Temple's map supplies the contact layer, the claim that the same system appears in older Mediterranean and North African sources as a hidden lineage rather than a local invention. Scranton's symbolic reading adds the machinery, the language of seeds, vibrations, and densities that turns Dogon myth into something resembling a technical manual written in ceremony instead of equations. Together, they turn the entire tradition into a single proposition, that precise stellar mechanics can survive inside a closed oral culture for centuries if the ritual is strict enough. The result feels less like lost astronomy and more like a deliberate time capsule, a science that accepted it might one day be mistaken for religion and planned accordingly. The fieldwork that came after Griol and Dieterlen tells a messier story. Later anthropologists working among the Dogon reported no trace of the elaborate Sirius system in the same villages, and the clean transmission of orbital periods and companion stars began to look more like an artifact of prolonged, leading conversations than an untouched oral archive. The original transcripts show Griol returning to the same elders year after year, refining questions about the stars as he learned more himself. What started as scattered references to a faint companion and a heavy seed appears to have been sharpened and expanded under that pressure, turning suggestive fragments into a coherent astronomical diagram that matched Western data a little too neatly. Sirius B itself had been photographed and calculated by Earth telescopes decades before the 1950 paper reached print. Once that fact is on the table, the possibility of cultural leakage, mission talk, or even a single well-thumbed astronomy book in the region stops being paranoid and starts being ordinary. Researchers who arrived without the same focused questions about Tolo found myths about the Nommo and creation, but nothing that required an invisible white dwarf or a 50-year orbit. The discrepancy is not dramatic scandal so much as ordinary variation in how stories travel, and how much an outsider's expectations can steer them. The leap from, "these people noticed something unusual about Sirius," to "non-human visitors handed them the equations," simply outweighs what the record can carry. The evidence is real, but thin, and the cleanest version of the tale does most of the heavy lifting. What survives the pressure is still strange enough: a West African myth cluster that isolates one of the sky's smallest and heaviest objects, a companion star that really does exist, and a story that refuses to stay debunked no matter how many times the details are walked back. The Dogon still perch on those sheer cliffs, their eyes turned toward a star they named before telescopes could reach it, carrying the memory of a heavy seed that fell from the sky, a story that keeps resurfacing no matter how many times it is weighed and found wanting. If that vision lingers, subscribe for the next file